think about not just the leads who you want to engage, but up at the account level, because there's a difference, especially if you have data on leads who might already from those accounts might be engaged with you, reading content, downloading things, you're looking at them in your systems. You also need to ask up at an account level, not just for this engaged lead, what happens if they don't buy from us, and how does that create a need? And so an example, um, so this was about 2 years ago. So this was over the summer, right after COVID had hit. I was developing a deal with a beauty and makeup company. And traditionally, they would sell by people coming into malls, retail stores, sitting down and getting makeup like put on them so they could see how it looked. Well, in COVID, you couldn't do that, right? So that created a pretty big shift in how they then had to sell their products, and looking at in innovation, job hire or key hire that they were making in the job description, they were talking about this virtual try-on experience. And at the time, the product that we sold, it was for large Fortune 500 innovation teams looking to acquire and use startups technology to integrate that into their business. And so I referenced that project and said, hey, would love to look at some data in our platform about AR, VR type startups who could help you very quickly stand something up on your site to help customers kind of see, how makeup would look. And that deal happened in just under 3 months when the typical sales cycle time was north of 10 months.
Wow.
And that's the difference between a lead and an account. And when you see that need up at an account level with a project that's already backed, man, go all in on that one.
What's up, everybody? We have a special guest for today's mailbag edition of the Outbound Squad podcast. We have Nate Nasralla with us today. He's the founder over at Fluent, who they're all about helping reps stop losing deals when not in the room by selling with your champion. And Nate's posted a lot of really great stuff. He has some cool playbooks and such that he's been a part of, and has done some collaboration with Jason in the past. Nate, welcome to the show. Happy to have you on board, man.
Thanks, guys. Really good to be here. I've been looking forward to it.
Awesome. So as always, we're addressing questions from the audience today. Brendan, what do we got for today?
Well, I think this question is perfectly timed, especially with our guest today, Nate. We're going to be unpacking account prioritization with this question. So the scenario here, real quick, we got as it reads, hey, was just recently promoted from SDR into an AE role, and I'm in the midst of training and will be hitting the ground running January 1st. They've given me a list of 100 accounts. How would you suggest I prioritize these?
Well, first, congrats. That's a really exciting jump. Way to start the new year in a new role. That's pretty great. So you have about 100 different accounts that you can go after. It sounds like you are moving up into kind of an enterprise type role if your universe is about 100. So I'm going to assume there's a little bit of research that you can do, right? You're going to invest a little time into the prioritization process. So the thing that I would start with is, and here's kind of the framework or the visual you can have. Think about a 2x2 grid. And on one axis are big accounts. The next axis is fast moving accounts. And so think about, okay, what are you prioritizing in light of? Ideally, you want a big contract that you can close very quickly. Like, how cool would that be to start your new role with a big, fast contract? Okay. So priorities are always in light of outcomes. So if you think of the top right, that's your category A, big deals that will move fast. So the question then, as it relates to what would drive a large account, those are more, or a large deal, those are more of account-based factors. Who are the people who have bought large deals in the past? What do they look like? What do they have in common? What are some of the patterns? If you ran a report of over this last year, maybe people who, and you just kind of filter by deal size, what are some of the patterns? Can you talk to and ask some of the reps who were closing those deals, hey, what was it about this account that led to the deal size? Was it a certain use case? Was it a certain team that you started with and how you developed the deal from there? Right. So that's the first piece. Now, the next piece is the sales cycle. How can I find the deals that will move fast? Which is more a question of when, not who. And so it's timing. So then the question is to say, okay, the deals that took a long time to close versus those that were moving very quickly, what was the event that was happening? What already existed inside of that account? Because to get a deal to move fast like that, it's not something that you can manufacture, it's something that you have to find. And so if you were coming from the SDR's point of view, you probably thought a lot about trigger events that created the timing for your outreach. You can carry that same kind of thought process on through. And then you're beginning to get to this profile of, okay, here's my category A, big deals that move fast, what they look like and when, or what's going on inside of that account. Now, the next question is more something that you probably want to ask your manager, your leader. What's the bigger win in their mind? Smaller deals that you're closing quickly, maybe learning from, versus larger deals that you are spending more time to work. That's your category B. And I would say probably early on, I would go to that first example, like fast but smaller wins, because that's how you're going to start to learn really, really quickly. And then you can roll those up into the larger opportunities, which would then make that your C, and then your category D here, which would be small deals that move very slowly. I would say, hey, should you even be working those at all? May they, maybe they're stealing some time, effort, energy from the others. However, there's also a case to be made. Maybe you're brand new walking into this industry for the first time. I don't know if you are jumping into a new company into the AE role, or maybe being promoted up within the same organization, same industry. And so you may say, hey, those are actually going to be some of my quote practice swings, that I'll try to learn from, get some first conversations from. Low pressure, low anxiety. I can kind of ease into it. Maybe I'll mix some of those into my early outreach first. So I have kind of some other thoughts, but I'll pause there. That would be my simple 2x2 grid to get you started.
I love that. To double click on a few of those things, some of those I hadn't thought about, Nate, so I appreciate you sharing. But some additional thoughts to kind of include in there for folks. Whenever you're looking at like trigger events and like, hey, these deals that make sense, they look a lot like other large deals we've closed and they had good velocity. Some things that people don't always look at that I've found to be super helpful when kind of analyzing deals and looking at these companies. Number one is like, what does the company that I'm looking at, like, what do they brag about and what do they promote? So that could be ads that they're running on LinkedIn. If you don't know this, anyone, you can go to any company and go look at, there's a tab under posts where you can look at like what ads are running right now. Are they promoting some big event that's coming up? Are they promoting a partnership that's happening? Is it a product release? Or are they just running like tons of educational webinars? Maybe they're collaborating with a company and maybe there's more to the story there. These kind of things are something that we kind of gloss over sometimes when looking at accounts. It comes just, team size of this, head count, revenue, etc. So some things to consider when you're drilling in there, as well as like if you need certain tech integrations or if a certain tech stack makeup and certain key pieces of infrastructure make that account very good. Those are all things that I've seen slow deals down if we can kind of get ahead of some of that and know that going into I find helpful. The other side that I was thinking about as you were going through kind of that 2x2, Nate, was with when you're going in to look at, let's say you go through that 2x2 exercise that Nate had. Like the next step I would use to kind of prioritize that or maybe personalize your outreach a little bit more is like, who do I know that's potentially connected with some of these folks? So actually leveraging some of the LinkedIn network you have, or even like past jobs you have, past bosses, past like I recently leveraged a CCO that I used to work for who I had a great relationship with. Turns out she was connected with someone that I was trying to talk to, and that became a very easy introduction. So in terms of like how easy would this conversation be to get started to, and just get my foot in the door, would be kind of the next layer I'd zero in on. If you want more on that, what was it last week, Brendan? I think we just recorded some of those low hanging fruit plays. Incorporate that on top of what Nate just went through, and I think that would be absolute money from a prioritization standpoint. The other big principle I think to keep in mind as an SDR is you're going from having 8 hours a day to prospect to maybe 20% of your week to prospect long term. Obviously, first starting, you do have all day. That's what you should be doing. You should be prospecting and building the pipeline. But once we get those meetings landed and we have deals in the pipeline, your time becomes much smaller amount of time that you have to prospect. So I would think around 20-25% of your week is the mindset you're operating. So as you're going through this process, it'd be setting up systems to help make that doable with a decent volume and quality with only that window of time. That's the other big shift I see SDRs stumble on. We could go a lot of different directions on that, but I guess, Nate, did that bring up any additional thoughts for you and kind of account prioritization?
Yeah, well, I love the fact that you were going back to this idea of like, what are you optimizing for at first? It should be learning and fast conversations, easy ins. Wherever you have an easy in to get something started, great. Your point around tech stacks made me think about a favorite is if you look at job descriptions recently posted for some type of key hire, typically it references projects or initiatives that the company has already greenlit internally. Typically there's going to be some type of budget, and it's going to tell you what are they already sold on as a issue or a need that needs to happen and happen quickly. So look for project names or project titles in a job description. By the way, that gives you language that you can use in your outreach to very quickly hook into that account. And then the last thing that it raised for me, kind of speak of initiatives, and actually an example of this is think about not just the leads who you want to engage, but up at the account level, because there's a difference, especially if you have data on leads who might already from those accounts might be engaged with you, reading content, downloading things, you're looking at them in your systems. You also need to ask up at an account level, not just for this engaged lead, what happens if they don't buy from us, and how does that create a need? And so, an example. Um, so this was about 2 years ago. So this was over the summer, right after COVID had hit. I was developing a deal with a beauty and makeup company. And traditionally, they would sell by people coming into malls, retail stores, sitting down and getting makeup like put on them so they could see how it looked. Well, in COVID, you couldn't do that, right? So that created a pretty big shift in how they then had to sell their products, and looking at in innovation, job hire or key hire that they were making in the job description, they were talking about this virtual try-on experience. And at the time, the product that we sold, it was for large Fortune 500 innovation teams looking to acquire and use startups technology to integrate that into their business. And so I referenced that project and said, hey, would love to look at some data in our platform about AR, VR type startups who could help you very quickly stand something up on your site to help customers kind of see, how makeup would look. And that deal happened in just under 3 months when the typical sales cycle time was north of 10 months.
Wow.
And that's the difference between a lead and an account. And when you see that need up at an account level with a project that's already backed, man, go all in on that one.
Oh, there's so many principles there: discovery and demo and prospecting and relevance to personalization. Those are the kind of things that the huge difference maker whenever you can personalize it at that relevant of a level too. You mentioned at the account level, and I think that also creates that's the secret of what creates that shortened sales cycle, because from the jump we're attaching to like this
Mhm.
larger initiative, which is everyone's problem. It's like how do I drive urgency? Well, we got to be attached to something bigger. We have to be,
Right.
or otherwise, like you can't manufacture artificial urgency. Like it has to be attached to something bigger. So I love that. The only other thing that I would point out here when thinking about triggers as an example is sometimes also look at your account. Like maybe you go through, let's just pretend you go through 100 of these accounts and you're like, man, Ethan, nothing's jumping out of me as like some really great like triggers that fall into that bucket of like it's going to move fast. Well, if you haven't done this, a really common thing that I do that I think people skip on sometimes is like look at their go to G2 or Crunchbase or any of these sites and find who their top competitors are and look for triggers with them. And so then we can
Mm.
leverage that as an outreach with like, hey, saw your competitors do XYZ.
Mm.
I'm sure you probably go up against them in, many deal cycles. And one thing we know, that they do very well is X, but you do X. Like if you can personalize that level and you can gather that type of information from consumer reviews, and you can leverage that as triggers as well. So if you're having trouble maybe finding something like Nate just mentioned or some of the other things that we're talking about, maybe check out what their competitors are doing and see how you can leverage some of those as a push to get people in the door to have a conversation. Um, that said, I think that's about all I had to say on account prioritization at the moment. But I'm going to do a little 2-for-1 bonus today, because Nate, you made a really great post I saw on LinkedIn today around demo follow-ups, and we happen to have a question roll in around that. So this person asked, and also considering this is what I would assume is maybe some of what Fluent does too. So I think it's great timing. But someone asked kind of what are some best practices to consider when writing follow-up emails for demo. This is something we haven't talked a lot about on this segment of the show either. So I'll let you take it away, Nate, since you're kind of, maybe this is top of mind for you on the content side. But what are some things you would say to keep in mind when writing follow-up emails for demos?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, I'll kind of continue with the current context, or assuming that You're not selling to one person who is the only person in the sales cycle. That instead there's going to be a bit of a consensus driven buying decision, right? There's going to be a couple different people. And maybe you started with, a manager or director level contact, and you need to figure out, okay, how do I get everybody else excited in this deal? How you follow up on that one demo is going to either help or hinder the person that you're first working with in creating that excitement and driving that interest from the rest of the buying team. Now, what most people do that is not helpful, it hinders that, is they stack up a bunch of links. Here's our product deck, case studies, recordings, and so on. And in my research with buyers in developing our product, so I've interviewed over 200 B2B buyers in the last year, and they talk about it in the context of a phrase that they use, the treasure hunt. They're like, this post demo email sends me on a treasure hunt. I have to open up all of these different things, hunt down the one or two lines that are relevant. I stitch them together into something that relates to what my team will actually, one, read, and two, see not as like me selling them, but it relates to how we talk about problems and goals internally. And so most of what gets stacked up, typically because it's relying on, a template or something that's fast and easy. And like, I get it. We all have a target to hit, a job to do. We want to move through these tasks as fast as possible. Typically, all of that's related back to product. And instead, so there's a couple different frameworks that we can break down. Things that you want to think about. One, what is the most important soundbite that relates to a big hair on fire problem that's got to be solved? That's got to be front and center. It can't be buried. You can't dilute your follow-up email by burying that under a bunch of stuff and creating that treasure hunt, right? Number one. Number two, it has to be affordable in a sense that you're bridging the gap between this contact's priority. Usually, people will have like a job that they're trying to get done and they have an issue with, but that's not exactly the reason why at a company level it's meaningful. So your messaging needs to bridge the gap between this one person that you're talking to, and then think of it more as like you're writing through them to get to other people on the buying team and the broader level initiative that this rolls into. So that's the setup. And what we can do is I'll go into two basic frameworks that you can use for this. And then, Ethan, you brought up the post that I referenced, or that I posted rather earlier today, and we can do that as a bonus one. So before I break down the frameworks, any kind of initial thoughts, things that you want me to unpack a little further there?
Yeah, one quick question, Nate, because you mentioned something I think is important that could maybe be glossed over. What I'm hearing a little bit is like above the line versus below the line personas here too.
Mm-hmm.
So in that, like, someone that is at that, VPC level, sometimes the thing we're selling, a coach, or probably not a champion, but a coach or an influencer in this deal, they may care a lot about how it makes our life easier, how I can get my like immediate job done today or fix this immediate pain, versus connecting to that larger thing as to why this makes sense at the higher level. Do you suggest like those being separate emails? Like, let's say I had a demo with let's say it's a technical product and I have the CTO and a VP of engineering, and then maybe I have like a director of DevOps or something like that that's like a user on the product. Would you potentially send different emails to those folks, or would you try to like get this all into one?
Yeah, so it depends on who was in the first conversation with you and who you ultimately need to bring in. If it is, for example, let's say you're talking with somebody who's below the line, manager level, they're more likely to be focused on workflow level questions. Then what you want to do is not exclude the thing that they were interested in, but you want to bridge it up above the line using a phrase which means. So you might say, for example, let's say you sell sales intelligence and you track down data on former users who changed jobs. You might say, hey, your sales team is spending a ton of time on manual research of past users, which means pipeline coverage is dropping below your ideal target, which means before the next fundraise that your CRO is thinking about, per rep productivity is tanking. And so now you've just jumped 3 levels. You've gone from the individual sales manager, perhaps up to a VP who's thinking about pipeline coverage and forecasts, up to the CRO that's thinking about the numbers they need to present to investors. So if the CRO VP weren't in that conversation, you can't neglect the thing that you showed this manager and they were excited about, but you need to do the work for them to help bridge the gap and make that message more affordable.
Love that.
Nate, not gonna lie, that was like some Inception type of stuff, going level by level by level. He just like kicked 3 levels in that. That was awesome. I like that little phrase too, which means, and it flows right to it. So that was really neat.
Love that.
There you
Awesome.
go.
Okay, we can keep rolling to the framework we were going to go to next. Yeah.
Okay, cool. Well, let's go with kind of the basic demo follow-up, which is your alternative to link stacking, right? Burying a bunch of information below a series of kind of more templated default links. So the first thing that you want to do is reframe the problem, right? What people get really excited about is when you show them something that they didn't realize about an issue that has been plaguing them. They're like, oh, this person knows their stuff, right? Because if you understand their problem better than anybody else, they're most likely to believe that your solution is a better fit than anybody else's as well. So you might say something like, "Hey, you thought that the issue was not enough leads. However, it's leads that just aren't highly qualified enough." Something like that. So it's not about volume; it's about lead quality, about readiness to buy. So you're reframing the problem. Number two is you're describing the approach to solving that problem from the conversation, or in other words, why do they believe this will work, right? And so this isn't product features. This is this the right way to go about solving this? Because later you'll introduce how your product enables that approach. So you're describing the logical approach there. It's like, hey, you need to surface more product information earlier on the website, which you believed would lead to faster sales cycles with more educated leads or qualified leads, right? Then what you're doing is you're creating some tension. Like every good story, it's the universal framework for any story ever. A character wants something, they go after it, and they hit a challenge, right? And there's something that will either be comedy or tragedy in the ending. And it's like, hey, look, if you're successful in following this approach, you're going to drop cycle times from 60 days to 40 days. But if not, you're going to have some hard decisions to make that financial model for next year work. And that's not something that you want to be up against, right? And then you bring in the product to say, okay, this is how we enable that approach. You avoid the dramatic tension, the hard decisions, you get that good outcome. And so that's where you might bring in, for example, one case study or something that is similar and say, hey, this is how, the team over at Gong did this. And then your final wrap up piece is a call to action based on how you need that email to travel internally, right? And so that's where the phrase which means may come in as you're describing, like, hey, if you follow this product, this is what it means. So to recap, you're reframing the problem, inserting a logical approach that they believe is the right path, creating tension, good things or bad things will happen, how you can enable your product, them to capture that good ending, and then thinking about how within that organization that email needs to be forwarded on or passed on. So there's your basic framework to ditch all of the links and the standard template.
Love that so much. I don't really have anything to add there, Nate. That's beautiful. And I'm going to also, in the show notes, if you did not catch Nate's post today, I thought it was really fantastic, not only for what we're talking about today and a really good framework for your demo follow-up emails, but also some good insight. If you ever have one of those demos or even a discovery call, in my opinion, his framework from today also works of like you forgot to mention something or maybe a question that you failed to ask and how you can kind of leverage some of this to reach back out to those folks as well. Nate, appreciate you coming on the show so much today. I think some really great knowledge bombs for everyone listening today. Anything you want to plug or where should folks find you? Anything you want to leave the audience with?
Yeah, aside from LinkedIn, best place is to go check out the blog, fluent.io/blog. It's where I post long form content. And I'd recommend, based on the topic today, check out the one. There are 13 mid-funnel email frameworks that you can grab, one of those being the one that we just walked through. So it might be most helpful. And guys, thanks so much for having me on. It was a really fun time. So thank you.
You're welcome. Nate, thanks for hopping on the episode today. It was amazing insight. I mean, biggest takeaway for me was the inception piece about which means the 3 levels in follow-up. Really amazing nugget that you gave there. But listeners, if you haven't done so already, go to the show page on whatever podcast app that you use, smash that follow button. These Mailbag Thursdays come out, as you guessed it, every Thursday right here on the Outbound Squad podcast. You can also submit your questions to us via outboundsquad.com/mail. Also, head over to LinkedIn, give myself and Ethan a follow, and we'll see you next week.